New York City, a cold winter evening, a blazing auction hall. 500 of the city's most powerful guests, and one portrait about to blow everything apart. Sabine looked up at the painting and smiled. She donated it herself. She's already gone. Then the rear door swung open.
Evelyn walked in, 7 months pregnant, calm in a way that made the whole room go quiet.
500 people held their breath. By the end of this night, who would really be the one erased? Stay with me for this story and subscribe so you don't miss how it ends. Evelyn found out on a Tuesday. She was sitting in her temporary apartment on the Upper West Side, shoes off, feet propped on a stack of legal folders, eating cold soup straight from the can because she'd forgotten to buy bowls. 7 months pregnant and running on about 4 hours of sleep. The kind of tired that doesn't go away after one night. Or two. Her phone buzzed. A Google alert she'd set up months ago for the Hartwell name. She glanced at it the same way she glanced at everything lately half present, waiting for something that mattered. Then she sat up straight. The alert linked to a press release from the Cross Family Foundation. A charity auction. Black tie, Manhattan, 3 weeks away. VIP tickets already sold out, 500 guests on the confirmed list, and near the bottom of the page, listed as Lot 7, was a painting. Eleanor Hartwell, oil on canvas. Circa 1891. Donated by Evelyn Hartwell Cross in celebration of the Foundation's charitable mission. Evelyn read that sentence 3 times. She set the soup can down on the floor, stood up slowly because standing up quickly wasn't really an option anymore. She walked to her window and looked out at Amsterdam Avenue for a long moment, watching yellow cabs crawl through traffic below. Then she picked up her phone and called her husband. Thayer picked up on the 4th ring. Evelyn. "Tell me you know what's in that auction listing," she said. A pause. "Which listing?" "Lot 7. Thayer, the Eleanor Hartwell portrait." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear him moving somewhere, a door closing behind him. "Sabine told me you authorized the donation before you left," he said. Evelyn pressed 2 fingers to her temple. "I didn't authorize anything. She has a signed form." "She has a signed form," Evelyn repeated slowly. "Dated when?" "March 14th. March 14th. She almost laughed. "Thayer. I was in the hospital on March 14th. I was admitted for elevated blood pressure and early contractions. There are nurses, doctors, records, pull any of them. Evelyn, I was in a hospital bed. I signed nothing." She heard him exhale. Not the exhale of a man who just realized something terrible. It was the exhale of a man who was already tired of this conversation before it started. "She also has a recorded message. Your voice, confirming the donation." Evelyn closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "I would like you to pull the auction," she said. "I can't do that based on what? My word?" "The word of your wife, who you haven't spoken to in 3 months, about a portrait that belongs to my family. Based on documentation I've already reviewed and found credible." Sabine brought this to the board in good faith, Evelyn. "If I pull the lot now, based on nothing but a counterclaim, it's going to look like I'm giving preferential treatment. It's going to embarrass everyone involved." There it was. Embarrass. That was always the word with Thayer. Not wrong, not unfair, not illegal. Embarrassing. "The painting belongs to the Hartwell Maternal Trust," Evelyn said carefully. "It has been passed through the women in my family for over 100 years. My grandmother carried it out of a burning warehouse during a fire in 1967. My mother kept it in climate-controlled storage for 15 years when she couldn't afford to insure it. It is not a cross-family asset, and it was never mine to donate. Evelyn." His voice dropped like he was explaining something to someone who was being unreasonably emotional. "I understand you feel—" "Don't. Silence. Don't do that," she said quietly. "I'm not calling because I'm upset about the separation. I'm calling because someone forged my name on a legal document while I was hospitalized, fabricated audio evidence, and is attempting to auction off a piece of my family's history at your foundation's gala. That is a crime. I need you to stop it." Thayer was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was measured and flat in the specific way it got when he'd already made a decision and was only continuing the conversation out of courtesy. "I'll speak to Sabine, but unless you can provide documentation that directly contradicts what she's already submitted to the board, I'm not in a position to pull the listing. That would create a legal liability for the foundation. And if I had a lawyer file an emergency injunction, then I'd have to advise the board to respond accordingly." She let that land, sat with it for a moment. "Okay," Evelyn said. "Okay? Thank you for taking the call." She hung up. For a few minutes she just stood there in the quiet apartment, palm flat on the window glass, watching her own reflection. Somewhere below, a cab driver leaned on his horn. A woman on the sidewalk laughed at something on her phone. The world kept moving. Evelyn walked to her desk, pulled open the second drawer, found the folder she'd started building the day she moved out of the Cross Townhouse documents, notes, dates, things she'd copied before leaving, half because she was organized and half because some quiet instinct told her she might need them. She opened her laptop and pulled up the auction catalog. The listing was polished. Beautiful photography, elevated language, donated in the spirit of generational giving. A short paragraph about Eleanor Hartwell that described her in vague, warm terms without actually saying much. The photograph of the portrait was professional, well lit. Evelyn leaned closer. Something was missing. She'd grown up with that portrait in her grandmother's house. She'd studied it as a child, pressed her nose too close, trying to understand the expression on Eleanor's face. She knew every detail of that canvas, including the Hartwell maternal trust seal, pressed into the lower left corner of the frame's backing. The catalog showed the front of the portrait only. There was no photograph of the back, no seal, no registration mark, no trust documentation. Standard auction protocol for a piece with provenance would have included all of it. Evelyn sat back. Then she picked up her phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't used in over a year. Marcus Avery, art conservator. He'd worked with her grandmother's estate when Evelyn was in her mid-20s, and he was one of the most meticulous people she'd ever met. He documented everything. He also never talked to journalists, never attended galas, and had no particular interest in the Cross family's social calendar. She dialed. He picked up on the second ring. Evelyn Hartwell Cross, he said. It's been a while, Marcus. I need a favor. Discreetly. She heard him set something down. A coffee mug, probably. He always had a coffee mug. How discreet.
Very, that portrait your family owns, he said. The Eleanor one.
Evelyn paused. You've seen the listing. I saw it this morning and I almost called you. Figured you'd reach out when you were ready. A brief silence. What do you need? Shipping records. The portrait hasn't moved in 11 years. It's been held at a private storage facility under the trust's name. I need to know when it moved, who authorized the transfer, and whether anyone has filed updated registration paperwork with the New York State Arts Registry. I also want someone to look at the original registration photographs. You're thinking they altered more than the ownership documents. I'm thinking. Evelyn said that Sabine Mercer is not an impulsive woman. She doesn't rush. She doesn't leave loose ends. If she went to the trouble of forging a signature and manufacturing audio evidence, she thought it through, which means she also thought about the seal. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You think she tampered with the canvas? I think the catalog shows no photograph of the back of the painting. For a piece with documented trust ownership, that's not an oversight. That's a choice. I'll start making calls today, he said. How much time do we have? The auction is in 3 weeks. I'll be in touch. She thanked him and hung up. Then she opened a fresh page in her legal folder and wrote the date at the top. She wrote down every detail of her conversation with Thayer, time-stamped, every detail of the listing she could document, the missing seal, the missing back of canvas photograph. Her attorney, Dana Cho, called while Evelyn was still writing. Dana had that particular energy she always brought to incoming emergencies, sharp, fast, not unkind, but definitively not here for pleasantries. I saw the listing, Dana said. Please tell me you're going to let me file an injunction. Not yet, Evelyn. Dana, if I file now, Sabine knows I'm moving. She pulls the lot, says it was a clerical error, and we spend 6 months trying to prove something that disappears the moment the auction gets canceled. We have a forged document and a fabricated recording. That's fraud, but only if we can show where the money goes. Right now, we don't know who benefits from the sale. Dana was quiet for a moment. You want to let it run, long enough to see where the money lands, long enough to see who she's working with and why she needed this specific painting, and in the meantime, the portrait sits in an auction house, and anyone can walk in with a big enough check. Yes, Evelyn said. I don't love this, I know. Another pause. Are you doing okay? Physically, I mean. Evelyn glanced down at her stomach. The baby had been remarkably cooperative today, staying quiet while she sat still and stressed and ate cold soup. I'm fine. We're both fine. Okay. Dana's voice shifted back to business. Keep me updated on what the conservator finds. If anything changes with the listing, I want to know immediately. And if that recording surfaces publicly, we act. No waiting. Agreed. After she hung up, Evelyn sat in the quiet for a long time. She was not a woman who fell apart easily. That wasn't stubbornness. It was just the inheritance of a certain kind of upbringing. Her grandmother had run a private relief fund for 30 years without once losing her composure at a board meeting, and her mother had fought a prolonged legal battle with a state agency without raising her voice in court, not even once. Hartwell women didn't make a scene, they made decisions. But sitting there in an apartment that still didn't feel like home, with someone else's furniture and her grandmother's legal folders stacked against the baseboards, Evelyn let herself acknowledge what was actually happening. Sabine Mercer had stolen Eleanor's portrait. She'd put Evelyn's forged signature on the paperwork and her manufactured voice on a recording and presented it to Thayer, who had reviewed the documents and found them credible and decided that was enough. He hadn't called Evelyn to ask. He hadn't reached out in 3 months to ask anything at all. He'd seen a signature and heard a voice and stopped there because stopping there was easier than what came next. That was the part that sat with her. Not the theft, not even the forgery, the fact that Thayer had accepted it. She stood up slowly, walked to the kitchen, and put the soup can in the recycling bin. She found a box of crackers on the counter and ate 3 of them standing up, looking at nothing in particular. The baby shifted. She pressed one hand to her side and waited until it passed. Outside, the city was doing what the city always did. Moving, honking, arguing with itself at a volume that somehow became background noise after a while. Evelyn went back to her desk. She pulled up the auction catalog again and looked at the listing for Lot 7. She studied the photograph of Eleanor's face, the steady, composed expression, the dark dress, the hands folded in a lap, the particular quality of stillness that the painter had somehow caught. Eleanor Hartwell had funded one of America's earliest private maternity relief programs on the quiet, without fanfare, without her name on a single building. She had considered that a matter of principle, not modesty. The point wasn't the credit. The point was the work. Someone had decided to sell her. Evelyn clicked out of the catalog, opened a clean document, started writing the timeline from the beginning, every date, every fact, every gap she still needed to fill. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to figure out exactly what Sabine had built and exactly how to let it come down around her. She was going to let the auction proceed. She was going to let Sabine stand in that ballroom and present Eleanor Hartwell to 500 people and accept the winning bid and sign the payment instructions. And then they were going to find out where the money went. Evelyn kept writing. The baby kept still. The city kept moving outside. It was going to be a long 3 weeks. The first press event was a breakfast. Private dining room at a midtown hotel. 40 donors, catered eggs nobody touched. Thayer sat at the head of the table in a dark suit and said the right things about legacy and generosity and the Cross Family Foundation's mission. And Sabine Mercer sat 2 chairs to his left and said everything else. Evelyn watched the video clip on her laptop at 7 in the morning, still in her robe. Someone had posted it on a donor's Instagram story. 53 seconds of footage, shot casually from across the table but perfectly framed on Sabine's face. She was dressed in a soft burgundy blazer. Her voice was warm, unhurried, the kind of voice people tend to trust at breakfast. Evelyn made the decision herself, Sabine was saying, in response to a question Evelyn couldn't hear. She wanted to do something meaningful on her way out, something that honored the family she was leaving. We thought it was a very gracious final gesture. A woman across the table said something sympathetic. Sabine tilted her head slightly. It was a difficult situation for everyone, but we respect her choice to step away, and we think the painting will do more good here than sitting in a trust somewhere. She smiled. Eleanor Hartwell would have wanted that. She was a generous woman. The clip ended. Evelyn closed the laptop, sat with the quiet for a minute, a gracious final gesture. She'd been in the apartment for 3 months, separated but not divorced, and apparently in that time she had abandoned her marriage, abandoned the foundation, and walked away from the only existing portrait of her direct maternal ancestor. She'd done it graciously, though. That was important. She opened the laptop again, pulled up the Cross Foundation's public press page. There were 2 more events that week, a donor luncheon on Wednesday, a cocktail reception Thursday evening with hospital executives. Sabine was listed as co-host for both. Her title on the event pages read Director of Philanthropic Partnerships, which was a title that had not existed at the foundation 2 months ago. Evelyn checked because she still had access to the archived org chart she'd saved before she left. She texted Dana, "Have you seen the press coverage?" Dana responded in under a minute, "Yes. She's positioning herself as the replacement, not just for the auction for you." Evelyn typed back, "I know. Dana, this changes the timeline. She's not just covering fraud, she's running a public narrative. By the time the auction happens, every donor in that room will believe you walked away willingly. Evelyn, that's what she needs them to believe. Dana, you could correct the record right now." One statement. "We don't even need to mention the portrait." Evelyn set the phone down without responding. She understood what Dana was saying. She also understood something Dana couldn't quite see from the outside. The moment Evelyn surfaced publicly, the story shifted. It became about the separated wife fighting for attention, about the messy personal life behind a polished charitable organization. Sabine would pivot immediately and make Evelyn's reappearance look like exactly the kind of dramatic disruption she'd warned the donors about. Sabine was good. That was worth acknowledging plainly. She was precise, and she was patient, and she had clearly been building this for longer than Evelyn realized. The Thursday cocktail reception made the society pages. There was a photograph of Thayer and Sabine standing in front of a large printed image of the Eleanor portrait, which had been mounted on a display board near the bar. In the photograph, Thayer was smiling. Sabine had her hand on his arm in the relaxed, confident way of someone who had decided the arrangement was already settled. The caption read, Thayer Cross and philanthropist Sabine Mercer unveiled the Cross Family Foundation's centerpiece auction piece, donated in support of maternity healthcare programs across the tri-state area. Evelyn read the caption twice. Cross Family Foundation's centerpiece, not the Hartwell family portrait. Not Eleanor Hartwell, founder of a relief fund. The Cross family's piece, already rebranded in print in a photograph, with Thayer standing right there giving it his implicit endorsement. She called Marcus. "I've been trying to reach you," he said, instead of hello. "What did you find?" "The shipping records were filed 6 weeks ago. The transfer was authorized under a document listing the foundation as the portrait's legal custodian." He paused. "That document doesn't match anything in the original Hartwell Trust registration. The registration number is real, but it's attached to a different piece, entirely a landscape that was deaccessioned from the trust in 2009. She swapped the registration numbers. Someone did, and that's not all." A pause. She could hear him clicking through something, papers or maybe files on a screen. "I pulled the original registration photographs from when your grandmother first documented the portrait with the State Arts Registry. The painting in those photographs and the painting in the auction catalog, they're the same canvas. Same dimensions, same cracking in the upper right corner that we documented in 2004. But the catalog lists the subject as an early Cross family figure. Not Eleanor Hartwell." Evelyn went very still. "She changed the identity," Evelyn said. "The catalog entry describes the subject as a philanthropic ancestor of the Cross family and credits the portrait's creation to a circle artist working in New York in the 1890s. There's no mention of Eleanor Hartwell by name. No mention of the Hartwell Maternal Trust." Marcus's voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man who documented things for a living and understood what documentation meant in a courtroom. "Evelyn, by relabeling the subject, they converted a trust-protected family heirloom into what appears to be a privately owned Cross estate piece. On paper, which means the foundation can present it as their own property." "On paper," he said again. She thanked him and called Dana before she'd even set the phone down from the previous call. "The portrait's been relabeled," Evelyn said. "They changed Eleanor's identity in the catalog. She's listed as a Cross ancestor now, not a Hartwell. And the registration number on the transfer paperwork belongs to a landscape that's been out of the trust since 2009. Dana was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "That's fraud on top of forgery." "Yes, Evelyn. This is enough to stop the auction. Today. We attach the registration evidence. We have the catalog entry right there in black and white. And what happens to the destination account?" Another pause. "We don't know where the money goes yet," Evelyn said. "If I file an injunction today, the auction gets pulled. The fraud stops, but the shell doesn't surface. Whoever is waiting to receive those funds just moves to another plan, another asset, another transfer, another forged form with my name on it. We stopped this one and we've stopped nothing. You're asking me to let stolen property sit in an auction house for 2 more weeks. I'm asking you to let me find out where the money lands." Dana exhaled, long and slow. "You're going to make me old before my time." "You're 38. Exactly. A beat. I want the conservator's findings in writing. Signed, dated, formatted for legal submission. I want it ready to file the moment you give me the word. He'll have it to you by Friday. And if Sabine moves the auction date, if something changes, then we move," Evelyn said, immediately. "Okay." Dana's voice shifted, softened just slightly. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." She heard Dana almost say something else, then decide not to. "I'll be in touch." The second week brought a new layer. Sabine gave an interview to a philanthropic giving publication. It ran online with a flattering photograph and a headline about vision and courage. Most of it covered the foundation's existing work in women's health care. Near the end, the interviewer asked about the auction. Sabine's answer was about 4 paragraphs long, and Evelyn read every word. She talked about struggling maternity programs, about funding gaps in understaffed wards, and the doctors who worked double shifts because their hospitals couldn't afford the staff they needed. She talked about the auction as a lifeline, the proceeds going directly to 6 specific programs across New York and New Jersey. Then the interviewer asked if there had been any controversy around the donated painting, and Sabine said, with what Evelyn imagined was a perfectly calibrated pause, that she wouldn't characterize it as controversy, only as a personal situation that had been resolved privately, and that the donor, she didn't use Evelyn's name, had been very clear about her intentions. Anyone who questions this sale, the interview made plain without ever quite saying it, is choosing a personal grievance over the survival of maternity health care. Evelyn put her phone face down on the table. That was the real construction. Not just replacing Evelyn personally. Sabine had built a structure where the portrait's sale was morally necessary, where objecting to it meant you were against struggling maternity wards and underfunded delivery rooms and overworked nurses, where the only person who might actually object was a woman who had walked away from her own marriage and was now, apparently, trying to walk back in through the side door. It was precise. Evelyn gave her that again, privately, without pleasure. She opened the foundation's public financial disclosures. The most recent one was 14 months old, which was technically within the filing window but on the late end. She went through the numbers slowly, line by line, in the way her grandmother had taught her to read documents, not looking for what was there, but looking for what wasn't. The foundation's balance was healthy on the surface. Major donations, steady investment returns, nothing alarming. But there was an operational line item in the second quarter that didn't correspond to any named program. A number sitting in a category labeled bridge allocation, which wasn't terminology Evelyn had ever seen in a foundation filing. She wrote down the number. Then she went back through previous annual disclosures, 3 years of them, and checked the same line. The bridge allocation category didn't exist before 14 months ago. She pulled up the auction catalog, found the estimated opening bid for Lot 7. She looked at the two numbers side by side. They were close, not identical. Close enough. She sat back in her chair. The baby shifted, a slow roll to the left, and she pressed her hand to her side automatically while she kept looking at the numbers. That was what this was. Not ambition, not even spite. There was a gap somewhere in the foundation's accounts, money that had gone somewhere it shouldn't have, and the portrait was the vehicle to fill it back in. Sell the painting for enough to cover what was missing, route the proceeds correctly, let the auditors find a clean balance sheet on the other side. Evelyn picked up her phone and called Dana for the third time that week. "I think I found the motive," she said. She walked Dana through the disclosures, the bridge allocation, the opening bid, the gap between a healthy-looking balance sheet and the number that didn't quite belong. Dana listened without interrupting, which was how Evelyn knew she was taking it seriously. "If that's accurate," Dana said slowly, "she's not just covering a fraud. She's using the auction to cover a deficit, which means there's money missing from the foundation's actual accounts." "Yes." And Thayer signed off on all the financial filings. Evelyn didn't answer that directly. "I need someone to look at the full account history, not the public disclosures, the actual internal ledgers. I know a forensic accountant. She's thorough and she doesn't talk." But Dana paused. "If there's a deficit in those accounts and Thayer's name is on the filings, this stops being just about the portrait." "I know. Are you prepared for what that means?" Evelyn looked out the window. Late afternoon light on Amsterdam Avenue, the city doing its usual thing. A woman walking a small dog, a delivery person on a bicycle, two kids arguing over something on the steps of a brownstone across the street. "I've been prepared since March 14th, she said. They stayed on the line for another few minutes, going through the details. Evelyn gave Dana the specific line items, the years, the page numbers. Dana said she'd contact the accountant in the morning. After she hung up, Evelyn made herself eat something real. She found bread and peanut butter in the cabinet and made a sandwich and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, watching nothing in particular. She thought about the interview, the maternity wards, the 6 programs Sabine had named. The painful part was that those programs were probably real. Underfunded maternity wards were absolutely real. Sabine had chosen her cover story well, selected something that couldn't be dismissed, something that actually mattered. What Evelyn couldn't figure out yet was whether Sabine genuinely believed her own justification. Whether she had told herself this was necessary, even heroic steal from one woman to save 6 programs, cover the deficit before anyone noticed, keep the foundation running. Whether she had looked at the numbers and decided the math worked out in her favor morally. Evelyn finished the sandwich, put the plate in the sink. It didn't matter what Sabine believed about herself. That had never been the question. The question was where the money would go when the gavel came down. She went back to her desk, added the new findings to her timeline, updated the dates, the document numbers, the disclosures she'd flagged. The auction was 2 weeks away. Somewhere in Manhattan, a portrait of Eleanor Hartwell sat in a climate-controlled storage room, relabeled, misidentified, waiting to be sold to someone who would never know whose eyes were in the painting. Evelyn turned the page in her folder and kept writing. Thayer found the signature on a Wednesday morning. He hadn't been looking for it. That was what stayed with him afterward, in the way certain details do when they arrive at the wrong moment. He'd been reviewing documents for the Unborn Child's Education Trust paperwork that Evelyn had prepared before she left. Thorough and organized in the specific way she did everything, initialed in 3 places and signed at the bottom in her careful, even script. He set that page next to the donation authorization form. He looked at them for a long time. The signatures were not similar. They were identical. Same pressure on the E, same small loop at the top of the H, same slight backward lean on the last letter. Not a convincing copy. A copy made by scanning one and transferring it directly to the other. The kind of thing that passed a quick visual check but fell apart the moment you put 2 documents side by side. He sat at his desk for 20 minutes without moving. Then he picked up his phone and called Sabine. She answered on the second ring, bright and ready the way she always was in the mornings. He asked her where she got the signed authorization form. She said she'd already explained that to the board. He said he was asking her again. There was a pause, brief, controlled, and she said she'd gathered it from Evelyn's office before Evelyn left, that Evelyn had signed multiple documents in those final days, that it was all properly documented. He asked her which office specifically, what date specifically. She told him she didn't have that in front of her right now and she'd follow up. He hung up. Thayer Cross was not a man who panicked. He was, by most accounts, extremely good at staying composed when things went sideways. He'd learned that in his 20s, watching his father manage several different crises with the same careful expression, and he'd absorbed it thoroughly. Composure was a tool. Sometimes it served him well. Sometimes it meant he didn't look closely enough at things until he had no choice. He took the two documents, put them in a folder, and called his driver. He didn't call ahead. Evelyn's apartment was on the 11th floor of a building on Amsterdam Avenue. He found the unit number through the attorney's. Hers had been in contact with his over minor separation logistics, and the address was in the correspondence file. He rode the elevator up and stood outside her door for a moment before knocking. She opened it on the third knock. He had been prepared for a lot of things. He had not been prepared for this. 7 months. She was clearly, visibly, undeniably 7 months pregnant. She was wearing a loose gray sweater, and her hair was pulled back, and she looked tired in the way that had nothing to do with the hour, and she looked at him with an expression that was completely unsurprised. That was the part that reached him. She wasn't surprised. She'd known he would eventually find his way here, and she had waited, and she had not called him. Thayer, she said. He couldn't find words immediately, which was unusual for him. He stood in her doorway looking at her, and she stepped back without being asked and let him in. The apartment was small and clearly temporary, a rental, furnished by someone else's taste, with boxes stacked against one wall and her grandmother's legal folders arranged along the baseboard with the particular precision that meant Evelyn had made her peace with the space. A half-full mug of tea sat on the desk next to an open laptop. The place had the feel of somewhere a person was working, not just living. He set the folder down on her kitchen table. The signature was copied, he said. Evelyn glanced at the folder. She didn't open it. From the child's trust documents, you knew. I suspected. Marcus confirmed it was a direct transfer. She moved past him, pulled out a chair, and sat down slowly, with the careful movement of someone managing their own weight. The originals are both in there. You can see it yourself. He opened the folder, looked at the 2 pages side by side in the actual light of her actual kitchen. It was worse here than it had been at his desk. Obvious. Embarrassingly obvious, once you were looking. He closed the folder. You should have told me, he said. About the baby. Evelyn.
Should have told you what exactly?
Her voice was quiet. She wasn't angry, which somehow made it harder to stand in that kitchen than if she'd been furious. You've been carrying my child for 7 months, he said. I didn't know. You didn't ask. I didn't know to ask. Thayer, she looked at him directly. You never asked why I left. You never called to find out what happened. Sabine brought you a signed form and a recording and you reviewed them and you found them credible and that was enough. You didn't call me to verify. You didn't reach out to anyone who might have spoken to me around March 14th. You found what you needed to find and you stopped. He started to say something. I was hospitalized the day that form was signed, she said. I told you that on the phone. Your response was to tell me you couldn't pull the auction listing because it would create a legal liability. A pause. You chose the foundation's reputation over your wife's word. That is what happened. The baby is separate from that. He stood there with the folder in his hands and nothing useful to say. She was right. He knew she was right, and he knew it in the particular way that landed in the body rather than just the mind-heavy and specific and not going away. He had chosen the easier interpretation. Sabine had handed him something neat and documented, and he had accepted it because the alternative was messier and more painful, and would have required him to look at his own marriage more honestly than he was prepared to. Learning about the pregnancy didn't undo that. He understood that too, standing in her kitchen. I want to help, he said. I know you do. Evelyn, I know, she said again, steady. But wanting to help now isn't the same as what you should have done before, and I need you to understand that before anything else. He nodded once. What do you need from me right now? Sit down, she said. I'll tell you what we found. She walked him through it methodically. The registration number swap, the relabeled identity in the catalog, the bridge allocation in the financial disclosures, and the way it matched the portrait's estimated opening bid closely enough to suggest a connection. The forensic timeline Marcus had built from the shipping records. Thayer listened without interrupting, which was an effort because several times his instinct was to defend something or explain something or point out that he hadn't been aware of any of this. He kept quiet. That was the least he could do at this particular moment, and he was aware of it. By the time she finished, his jaw was set. She used the painting as collateral, he said. That's what it looks like. There's a deficit in the foundation's accounts. Money that went somewhere it shouldn't have. The portrait's estimated value appears to have been listed as a temporary asset to fill the gap on paper, which means the balance sheets look clean until the sale closes. And the money moves. Moves where? That's what we're waiting to find out. He looked at her. Dana's involved? Has been from the beginning. And you've had a forensic accountant looking at the internal ledgers? She's still working through them. It takes time. Thayer set both palms flat on the table. I can pull the auction today, right now. I'll call the chair, tell him we're withdrawing Lot 7 pending a documentation review. That's a standard protocol. No one needs to know the full reason yet. No. Evelyn, I have the signature comparison right there. And what happens the day after you pull it, she said. Sabine regroups. She moves whatever's in that destination account. She finds another way to cover the deficit, or she disappears the evidence, or she puts an attorney in front of it and we spend 2 years in discovery. She shook her head. I need her to complete the transaction. I need her to sign the payment instructions in front of the auditors and the legal team, and 500 people who will all be witnesses. He was quiet for a moment. You're going to let her sell the portrait. I'm going to let her believe she sold it. He looked at her for a long moment, the apartment, the folders, the careful organized evidence she'd been building for 3 weeks, while he stood next to Sabine at presence and smiled for photographs. He didn't say anything about that because there was nothing useful to say about it. Okay, he said. What do you need me to do? Stay out of it. He wasn't expecting that. You want me to do nothing. I want you to attend the auction, sit beside the stage, and behave exactly as you have been behaving. If you suddenly distance yourself from Sabine, she'll notice. She's been watching every variable in this situation. Evelyn folded her hands on the table. The most useful thing you can do right now is be exactly what she expects you to be. He held that for a moment, nodded slowly. Before he left, Dana's forensic audio specialist sent through preliminary findings. Dana forwarded them to Evelyn, who opened the email on her laptop and read it while Thayer stood at her kitchen counter. The recorded authorization had been assembled from at least 4 separate voice messages. The specialist had identified seam points in the audio file where distinct recordings were stitched together, slight variations in background ambient noise, micro differences in Evelyn's vocal resonance that indicated different recording environments on different days. Taken individually, each clip sounded clean. Together, they revealed the construction. The background noise was the piece that mattered most. In 2 of the source clips, there was an elevator chime. Very brief, almost inaudible, the kind of thing a person editing audio might not think to remove because it was so ordinary. The specialist had isolated it and cross-referenced it with publicly available sound profiles from building directories. The chime matched the elevator bank on the 14th floor of a midtown office building. The 14th floor was where Sabine's private office was located. Evelyn read the findings twice. Then she turned the laptop so Thayer could see the screen. He read it in silence. She assembled it in her own office, he said. That's what the audio places. He stopped, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. That's not subtle. She didn't think anyone would look. Why would they? She had a signed form and a recording and your confirmation that the documentation was credible. Evelyn closed the laptop. She assumed the sale would close, the deficit would disappear, and I'd be too busy managing a separation to investigate a charity auction. Thayer didn't have an answer to that. He left an hour later. At the door, he turned and looked at her again. The same way he'd looked when she first opened it, but different now. Less shock, more something he was still working out. I'm sorry, he said. Evelyn looked at him. I know. She closed the door. She stood in the entryway for a moment, then went back to her desk. Marcus called that afternoon. I found the insignia, he said without preamble. Tell me. Under the restoration paint in the lower left section, someone applied a thin layer over the original Hartwell seal professional work, not rushed, the kind of thing that holds up to a casual visual inspection. But I used UV light and then imaging software to isolate the layers. A pause. The original seal is intact underneath. Hartwell Maternal Trust. Registered mark, exactly as documented in the 1989 filing. Evelyn exhaled slowly, which means, Marcus continued, that the portrait's original trust designation was never legally removed. You can't retroactively alter a trust registration by painting over the mark and filing new paperwork under a swapped registration number. The piece belongs to the trust. It has always belonged to the trust. Can you document that in a form that holds up in court? Already writing the report. I'll have it to you by tomorrow morning with full imaging documentation attached. She thanked him and wrote the finding into her timeline. Then she called Dana. Dana answered with, the audio findings came through. I read them twice, and Marcus found the original seal under the restoration paint. Beat of quiet, Evelyn. We have forged documentation, fabricated audio placed in Sabine's office, a digitally altered catalog entry, a painted-over trust seal, and what looks like fraudulent use of a misappropriated asset as financial collateral.
Yes, and you still want to wait. 1 week, Evelyn said. She needs to sign those payment instructions in front of witnesses.
Every piece of evidence we have proves what she did. But until the gavel comes down, we can't prove where the money goes. And without that, she walks into a boardroom with an attorney and explains every decision away as an administrative error. Dana was quiet for a moment. 1 week, she finally said. And then we're done waiting. 1 week, Evelyn agreed. She hung up, sat back in her chair. Outside the window, Manhattan was doing its late afternoon thing, light going orange over the rooftops. The noise from the street, shifting from the midday rush into something steadier and lower. She could hear someone's television through the wall. 7 days until the auction. She opened her folder and reviewed the timeline from the beginning. Every date, every document, every piece of evidence Marcus and Dana and the audio specialist had built. She went through it looking for gaps, looking for anything Sabine's attorneys might use to create uncertainty. She found 2 small gaps, wrote notes on how to close them. Then she turned to a blank page and started writing down what the auction night needed to look like. Who needed to be in the room? What position everyone needed to be in when the gavel fell? She was precise about it, working through the logistics with the same methodical attention her grandmother had brought to running a relief fund and her mother had brought to courtrooms. Sabine had spent 3 weeks building a public story about a woman who disappeared. She had 1 week left to finish believing it. The ballroom was full by 7. 500 people in formal wear, moving between round tables set with white linen and low floral arrangements, glasses of champagne making slow circles in practiced hands, hospital directors from 3 states, investors who had written large checks to the Cross Family Foundation for a decade, philanthropists whose names were on building wings and endowment funds, old money families who attended these events because attendance was itself a form of statement. The room glittered. That was the only word for it. It was the specific, curated glitter of a Manhattan charity event that had been planned by someone who understood exactly what wealth looked like when it wanted to feel generous. At the front of the room, mounted on a lit display platform between 2 floral columns, was the portrait. Eleanor Hartwell looked out at the crowd with the same composed, unhurried expression she had maintained for 130 years. The painting was beautifully lit, warm and precise, and the woman in it looked entirely at peace with being the most important thing in the room. Sabine had arrived early. She moved through the cocktail hour in a long black gown, greeting donors by first name, touching arms, laughing at exactly the right moments. She had the evening mapped in her head down to the quarter hour. She knew who would bid, at what level, and when. She knew where the cameras were positioned for the foundation's official photographer. She knew which board members were seated near the stage and which hospital executives needed a personal word before the formal program began. Thayer sat at the table beside the stage, as Evelyn had asked him to. He was in a dark evening suit, composed, and he spoke when spoken to and smiled when he needed to, and did not look at the rear doors of the ballroom any more than was natural. He did not know exactly what was coming. Evelyn had told him very little about the specifics. She'd said, "Be where you're supposed to be, do what you'd normally do, and don't interfere with anything that happens after the gavel falls." He had agreed, and he had kept that agreement. And sitting at that table through the cocktail hour was one of the harder things he'd done in a while. At 8 o'clock, the lights dimmed slightly, and the program chair took the podium. There were opening remarks, a brief video about the Foundation's maternity healthcare initiatives, acknowledgments of major donors. Sabine was introduced as Director of Philanthropic Partnerships, and she stepped to the podium to applause that was genuine and warm because she had earned it carefully over months. She spoke beautifully. Evelyn had listened to enough of Sabine's public remarks by now to recognize the architecture of them, the specific placement of gratitude before ambition, the self-deprecating pause before the important point, the way she made large numbers feel personal. She was talented. It was worth saying plainly even now. The auction portion began at 8:45. The first 6 lots moved quickly. Art and architectural drawing, a collection of rare letters. The bidding was brisk and the crowd was engaged, and Sabine stood near the stage with a glass of water, watching, her expression easy and calm. Then the auctioneer introduced Lot 7. Sabine set down her water and walked to the microphone. "This piece," she said, "represents something quite specific. It represents the intersection of family legacy and philanthropic vision." She turned slightly toward the portrait, a practiced movement. The woman in this painting was an early figure in the Cross family's history. A woman who understood that private wealth carries a public responsibility. She let that settle. It was donated to this auction by a member of our extended family who, in her own words, wanted it to do more good in the world than sitting quietly in trust. A brief pause, precisely measured. We honor that decision. And we honor this woman's legacy by ensuring the funds raised tonight go directly to the maternity programs that need them most. The room responded warmly, a murmur of appreciation. Sabine also wants to note, she continued, stepping slightly away from the microphone as if the next part were more personal than formal, that the family member who donated this piece is no longer part of our circle. She made her choices. We respect them and we carry her gesture forward. She stepped back. The bidding opened at 800,000. It moved fast. There was a bidder in the back of the room and another on the phone line and a third at a table near the left wall, and they went back and forth while the auctioneer kept pace, and the room tracked it with the focused quiet of people watching something expensive happen. Evelyn walked in through the rear doors at 9:14. She wore a simple dark evening gown with no ornamentation, and her hair was up, and her pregnancy was visible to anyone in the room who looked at her. She paused just inside the doors. Didn't move toward her husband. Didn't move toward the stage. She found a position along the back wall where she could see the stage, the auctioneer, and the signing table set up to the left of the platform. The room noticed her. Of course it did. A murmur moved through the tables near the back, slow and spreading, people leaning toward their neighbors. A few people turned fully around in their seats. A board member near the stage glanced back, then quickly forward again. Sabine did not turn around. The bidding continued. 1.2 million, 1.5. A pause, and then 1.8 from the phone line. A counter at 2 million from the man in the back of the room. Evelyn watched Sabine's profile, the controlled stillness of it, the way she tracked the bidding with her eyes without moving her head. The gavel came down at 2.3 million. The room applauded. The auctioneer confirmed the winner, a buyer, whose name was entered through the phone line, represented by an attorney in the room. The painting would be released to the buyer's representative upon completion of the ownership transfer and payment processing. Sabine moved immediately to the signing table. This was the part Evelyn had planned for. She had told Dana's forensic accountant, who was seated at a press table near the right wall with a foundation board observer and the auction house's senior auditor, to watch the signing table, to document every document Sabine touched, every signature she placed, every field on the payment instruction form. The payment instruction form was the key. It contained the destination account number, the account that would receive $2.3 million when the transfer cleared. Sabine picked up the pen. She approved the ownership transfer, signing where the auction house attorney indicated. She signed the release documentation. Then she moved to the payment instruction form and reviewed it briefly, with the quick professional familiarity of someone who had filled out the same form in her head 50 times already, and she signed it. She capped the pen. She personally pointed to a line on the form and said something to the auction house attorney that Evelyn couldn't hear across the room, but that the auditor, who was standing at the table, heard clearly. The gavel had fallen. The transfer was signed. The account was identified. Before the painting could be moved from the platform, the chairman of the event stepped to the microphone. He was a quiet man in his late 60s named Gerald Ossie, who had chaired hospital foundation boards for 30 years and was known primarily for being extremely careful about what he said in public. When he spoke, people listened because he didn't speak often. "Before we proceed," he said, "I'd like to ask Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell Cross to come forward." The room shifted. Sabine's head turned toward the rear of the ballroom for the first time all evening. Evelyn walked forward through the tables. People moved their chairs slightly to let her pass. The room was almost completely quiet by the time she reached the front. She stood beside Gerald Ossie and faced the crowd, one hand resting at her side, her pregnancy in plain view, her expression unremarkable.
Gerald Ossie looked out at the room. "The woman in that portrait," he said, "is Eleanor Hartwell. She is not a cross-family ancestor."
She was the founder of one of the earliest private maternity relief programs in American history, established in 1893, and she is the direct maternal ancestor of the woman standing beside me. A murmur moved through the room, a different kind of murmur this time. Eleanor Hartwell's work funded the foundational protocols for maternal care in 3 New York hospitals that are still operating today. Her private documentation, preserved by her family, contains correspondence with physicians who later established practices that became the standard of care in American obstetrics. She has been deliberately misidentified in tonight's auction catalog. He paused. Sabine stood at the signing table and did not move. "I want to make a second introduction," Gerald said. "Many of the organizations represented in this room tonight have been recipients of significant private funding over the last 11 years. Operating grants, emergency bridge funds, equipment purchases, staff support. That funding came from an entity called the Mother's First Initiative, managed by an anonymous founding trustee who had one condition for every grant, that her name never appear in any public material." He looked at Evelyn. The anonymous founder and controlling trustee of Mother's First Initiative is Evelyn Hartwell Cross. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then a woman near the left side of the room stood up. She was in her 50s in a blue evening gown, and she was the chief of obstetrics at a hospital in the Bronx that had received a $200,000 emergency grant 4 years ago when their neonatal unit nearly lost its operating license. She stood up and she started to clap. A man at the table beside her stood. Then a doctor from a New Jersey hospital system. Then a hospital administrator who recognized the name from grant documentation she'd reviewed twice a year for 7 years without ever knowing whose signature she was honoring. One by one and then in groups, people throughout the room rose from their chairs. Not polite applause, not the reflexive standing ovation of an event crowd. The deliberate, specific acknowledgement of people who understood exactly what was being said and who they were looking at. 500 guests rose to welcome a woman who had never asked to be welcomed. Evelyn stood at the front of the room and received it with the same composure. Eleanor looked out from the portrait with. She didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't make a speech. She stood there and let it happen, and that was enough. Sabine was still at the signing table. The shell had cracked. Evelyn could see it from across the room, not in Sabine's expression, which remained controlled, but in the specific quality of her stillness. She was calculating, still moving pieces internally, still working through the variables. That was who she was, even now. Gerald Ossie waited for the room to settle. Then the auction house's senior auditor stepped to the microphone. He was a man named Whitfield, gray-haired, precise in the way of people who spent their careers making sure numbers matched. He did not have Gerald Ossie's warmth, and he did not try to approximate it. In reviewing the payment instruction form signed moments ago, Whitfield said, in conjunction with documentation provided by independent legal counsel and a forensic accounting team, we have identified the designated recipient account as belonging to a shell entity registered in Delaware under the name Clearfield Charitable Holdings, LLC. He looked up from his notes. That entity is not a charitable organization. It has no IRS designation, no public charitable filing, no board of directors. Based on the documentation reviewed by this office, it is secretly controlled by the individual who signed the payment instruction form. The room understood. Some people looked at the signing table. Some looked at Thayer. Some looked at Evelyn. The murmur that moved through the crowd this time was lower and different in texture, the specific sound of 500 people recalibrating something they thought they understood. Sabine set down the pen she'd picked up again for no clear reason. Gerald Ossie said, simply, the auction house will be suspending the transfer pending a full legal review. What he did not say, and what became clear in the following 20 minutes as the room absorbed the situation, was that the legal review would involve the Foundation Board, the State Attorney General's office, and documentation that had been building in an apartment on Amsterdam Avenue for 3 weeks. The buyer's representative approached the stage and requested the portrait for immediate removal. His argument was straightforward and not wrong. His client had won the lot fairly under the terms in effect at the moment of the gavel. The fraud had been announced afterward. The sale, legally, had concluded. Whitfield told him the transfer was suspended. The attorney said the physical painting was a separate matter from the payment transfer. Dana appeared from somewhere near the right wall and had a quiet conversation with the attorney that lasted 4 minutes, and Evelyn watched it without approaching because Dana was the right person for that conversation, and Evelyn knew when to stay where she was. The portrait did not leave the platform that night, but the buyer did leave the hotel, and his attorneys made clear in writing before midnight that their client's position was that the sale had been legally completed, and that the painting's removal with the buyer was entirely within his rights, and that any attempt to recover it would be contested. Evelyn stood near the portrait for a long time after the formal program ended, and the room began to empty in small, quiet clusters of people who kept looking back. She looked at Eleanor. The composed expression, the dark dress, the hands folded in a lap, the woman who had spent her life doing useful things without her name attached to them. Thayer appeared beside her, not close, just present. He didn't say anything for a while. The buyer has the portrait, he finally said. Yes, Dana thinks the injunction. Won't be straightforward, Evelyn said. The trust language is old. There's ambiguity around whether I have sole authority to reclaim it in the absence of other living trust members. We'll have to argue it out. She paused. In public. He looked at her. What does that mean? It means that to fight for the portrait, I have to disclose everything. The trust, the initiative, the funding. The women in hospitals I've protected anonymously for 11 years. Their privacy, their histories, all of it becomes part of the public record. She looked at the painting. I have to choose between protecting what I built and fighting for what Sabine tried to take. The ballroom was nearly empty now. Staff moving through collecting glasses. The display lights on the portrait still on. Eleanor still looking out at whatever the room used to be. Evelyn turned away from the painting and picked up her bag. "We'll talk to Dana in the morning," she said. Thayer nodded. She walked toward the rear doors the same way she'd come in. A few people near the exit said her name as she passed. She acknowledged them briefly and kept moving. Behind her, the portrait stayed on the platform. Sabine had spent 3 weeks building a story about a woman who had walked away. On the night the gavel fell, 500 people stood up because the story was wrong. That was something. That was real, and it had happened, and it couldn't be undone. But the portrait was gone, and the fight, it turned out, was just beginning. The boardroom meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning. Evelyn arrived at 8:50. Dana was already there, seated on the left side of the long table with 2 folders open in front of her and a coffee she hadn't touched. The auditors came in at 8:55. Thayer arrived at 8:58 and sat across from Dana without saying much. Both legal teams filled in the remaining chairs. Sabine walked in at 9 on the dot. She was dressed sharply. Hair pulled back, dark blazer, the composed and unhurried expression she'd worn at every press event for 3 months. She sat down without being directed to a seat, chose the one that put her back to the windows and her face toward the room, and set a thin leather portfolio on the table in front of her. Her attorney sat beside her and immediately said that his client was present voluntarily and had not been charged with any crime. Dana said that was fine and that they were there to review documentation and that the meeting would be recorded. Sabine looked across the table at Evelyn. Her expression was unreadable but alert. "Before we start," Sabine said, "I want to acknowledge something." Everyone waited. Thayer signed every financial document I placed in front of him for 14 months. The budget amendments, the reallocation requests, the bridge allocation filings. She didn't look at Thayer when she said it. She kept her eyes on the auditors. "If this is a conversation about financial irregularities at the Cross Family Foundation, then we should be accurate about who authorized them." Thayer's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Sabine's attorney made a note. "If the foundation's records become public," Sabine continued, her voice steady, "and I want to be clear that I still have access to the full internal archive, it won't be a comfortable story for the Cross family. Signatures tell their own story. It doesn't matter why a person signed something. It only matters that they did." She let that sit there for a moment, a threat dressed as an observation. Then Evelyn opened her folder. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't alter her tone from the one she'd walked in with. She simply began. "March 14th. The donation authorization form bearing my signature was submitted to the Foundation Board. On that date, I was admitted to Lenox Hill Hospital with elevated blood pressure and early contractions. The hospital admission records are in the first tab. The attending physician's statement is in the second." She turned a page. "The signature on the form is a direct digital transfer from documents I prepared for the Child's Education Trust. A comparison of both documents is in the third tab. The forensic analysis confirming the transfer is in the fourth." She paused, turned another page. "The audio recording presented as my verbal authorization was assembled from 4 separate voice messages. A forensic audio analysis identified the scene points and the source environments. The elevator chime in 2 of the source clips was matched to the building where your private office is located. That analysis is in the 5th tab." Sabine was still, watching. The auction catalog listed Eleanor Hartwell under a false identity. The original registration photographs from the New York State Arts Registry show the same canvas confirmed by dimension and documented aging patterns, listed correctly as Eleanor Hartwell, Hartwell Maternal Trust Property. The catalog photographs are in tab 6 alongside the registry originals. Evelyn turned another page. A UV imaging analysis confirmed that the Hartwell Maternal Trust seal was not removed from the canvas. It was painted over. The original seal is intact beneath a thin layer of restoration paint applied within the last 4 months. The conservator's documented findings are in tab 7. She closed the folder. The payment instruction form signed at the auction directed $2.3 million to Clearfield Charitable Holdings, LLC. That entity is registered in Delaware, has no charitable designation, no board of directors, and no public filing history. Forensic financial records show it was established through a law firm that also handled your personal estate planning in 2021. She looked at Sabine directly. "That documentation is in tab 8. The room was quiet. Sabine's attorney leaned toward her and said something under his breath. She listened without moving, then turned back to the table. "I moved the money," she said, "to prevent 6 medical programs from losing their funding." Her attorney closed his eyes briefly. She kept going. "There was a deficit. It had been building for 2 years before I ever had access to the accounts. When I found it, the foundation was 3 months from a public audit that would have exposed it and pulled operating grants from programs that couldn't survive without them. I made decisions to protect those programs. The portrait was going to be moved from the trust eventually anyway. The trust language hasn't been updated since 1989, and it has no enforcement mechanism. I used it to cover a gap that would have hurt people who have nothing to do with any of this. She said it clearly and with conviction. She believed it. That was evident to everyone in the room. It was also a complete and detailed confession. Every point she made to justify herself confirmed a specific element of the scheme, the deficit she'd identified, the timing of the trust documentation review, the decision to use the portrait as collateral, the shell company established to receive and then redistribute the funds in a way that would obscure the original transaction. She walked through it to explain herself, and in doing so, she laid out every decision, every date, every choice that only the person who had directed the operation would know. Her attorney put his hand flat on the table. Sabine. She stopped. The auditor on the left side of the table was writing steadily. He had been writing since she said, "I moved the money." The foundation's general counsel said that based on the foregoing, the board would be moving to formally remove Sabine from her position effective immediately, pending the outcome of a referral to the state attorney general's office. Sabine picked up her portfolio. She stood. Her attorney stood with her. At the door, she stopped. She turned and looked at Thayer, and this time her expression was different, not cold, something more considered than that. "Your arrogance made this possible," she said. "You signed what I put in front of you because reviewing it carefully would have meant admitting the foundation had problems. You stood next to me at every event because it was easier than asking questions you didn't want answered. I worked with what you gave me." A pause. "I'm not asking you to agree with that. I just want it said." She left. The door closed. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Dana said very quietly, "That went into the record." Thayer nodded once. He looked at the table and said nothing. The referral was filed by end of day. The judge's temporary ruling came down 11 days later, and it went the wrong way. Evelyn read the decision at her kitchen table with Dana on speakerphone, going through it paragraph by paragraph. The buyer's attorneys had argued two things. First, that their client had purchased the painting without any knowledge of the underlying fraud, that the lot was publicly listed and properly processed through a licensed auction house, and that a good faith purchaser was entitled to protection under standard commercial law. Second, and more damaging, that the Hartwell maternal trust documentation from 1989 contained language sufficiently ambiguous to create genuine uncertainty about whether Evelyn, as the sole surviving trustee, had unilateral authority to reclaim trust property in a dispute situation. The judge had agreed that both points warranted review before any order of return could be issued. "So he's keeping it," Evelyn said. "For now. It's a temporary ruling, not a final one. We can appeal and we can continue the case." Dana paused. "But to continue it, the trust history has to become part of the public record. You have to demonstrate your authority over the trust, which means disclosing its full history, its beneficiaries, its funding activities. Your role in the Mother's First initiative, your pregnancy, why you kept all of it separate from your marriage." Evelyn looked out the window. "The women in those records," she said. "Yes. The hospitals, the private grants, the situations people disclosed to qualify for emergency support. 11 years of confidential information. The attorneys will push for protective orders. We can argue for sealed exhibits on the most sensitive material. But a meaningful portion of it becomes visible, Evelyn. That's unavoidable." She sat with that. She had built the Mother's First initiative the way Eleanor Hartwell had built her relief fund, quietly, with full attention to the work and no attention to the credit. The anonymity wasn't modesty. It was functional. People disclosed more when they weren't performing for a record. Hospitals admitted the extent of their shortfalls more honestly when the funding source had no public profile to protect. The work operated better in the dark. If she fought for the portrait publicly and fully, the dark went away. And if she didn't fight for it, Eleanor stayed misidentified in a buyer's private collection until whoever owned it eventually sold it again to someone who would know even less about who was in the painting. She thought about Eleanor, who had done her work for 30 years without her name on a single building and who had still made sure it was documented. The family histories, the trust records, the correspondence with physicians. She had understood that some things needed to be preserved even if they weren't displayed. "File the appeal," Evelyn said. "You're sure? File it." The day after the ruling, Thayer called and asked to meet. They sat in the same kitchen as before, same 2 chairs, same mug of tea she'd made and not finished. He told her he had resigned as chairman of the foundation. He said he had arranged to personally replace the missing funds from the foundation's accounts, using assets held in his private portfolio. He said he had already transferred operational oversight to an independent board with no cross-family representation. Evelyn listened. "Thank you," she said when he was done. "I should have her." She looked at him. "Those things were your responsibility. I'm glad you did them. But they're not a gesture, and I won't treat them as one. You corrected something you allowed to happen. That's what correcting your failures looks like. It's not the start of something new. It's just what should have happened. He nodded. Our marriage is separate from the foundation, she said. Fixing the foundation doesn't fix the marriage. Those are two different problems, and they don't solve each other. I know. I need you to actually know that. Not agree with me in this kitchen and then expect things to shift. I know, he said again. And this time it sounded less like agreement and more like understanding. He left without asking for anything. The buyer's name was Robert Cahill. He was 63, a private investor from Connecticut, and he had attended the auction because he genuinely collected American historical portraiture and genuinely had no idea what he was buying into when he made his phone bid on Lot 7. He found out the full story over the following 3 weeks, in the way people find out things when their attorneys are suddenly very busy in pieces, each one more complicated than the last. His personal attorney called Dana on a Thursday morning.
Mr. Cahill has reviewed the complete documentation, the attorney said.
The portrait's history, the trust records, the Hartwell family lineage, the conservator's findings. He's read the Eleanor Hartwell research your client's team compiled. A pause. He doesn't want to own something that was taken from someone's family. He would like to discuss a return. Dana called Evelyn before the attorney had finished the sentence. Cahill had one request. He had paid $2.3 million for the portrait, and he understood that he would not be getting that money back through any straightforward process. He asked only that the funds remain allocated to maternity health care programs, as the auction had claimed they would be. He had no interest in a refund from a shell company that was already under investigation. He wanted the money to go where it was supposed to go. Evelyn said yes, under one condition. The funds had to be managed by an independent hospital board. Not the Cross Family Foundation, not any entity connected to the Cross name. An independent board with representation from the programs that would actually receive the money, with full public accounting. Cahill's attorney called back the same afternoon. His client agreed. The portrait was transferred from Cahill's private storage to the original maternity center that Eleanor Hartwell's work had helped establish in Lower Manhattan, a building that had been renovated twice over the years, but still operated on the same block where Eleanor had attended its founding meeting in 1893. The transfer was handled quietly. No press event, no ceremony. Evelyn and Thayer were both there when it arrived. They stood in the main corridor while two conservators and a museum-trained installer worked out the placement. The room they chose was a wide hallway outside the center's main consultation area, where patients passed through every day. Across from the space they'd prepared for the portrait was a wall that the center's director had offered for a permanent installation, a long panel of engraved names, mothers whose care had been funded through Eleanor Hartwell's legacy, and through the programs the Hartwell Trust had quietly supported in the centuries since. Thayer helped hold a measuring guide for one of the conservators. He didn't try to manage the situation. He followed direction, moved when asked, stepped back when not needed. When they were done, the two of them stood in the corridor and looked at Eleanor. I trusted things that were easy to trust, Thayer said eventually. He wasn't making an excuse. He was just saying it plainly, finally, without the layer of composure over it. The documents were clean. Sabine was confident. Looking further would have meant admitting I'd missed something for a long time. I chose not to look. Evelyn stood with that for a moment. I kept things from you, she said. The pregnancy, the initiative, the reasons I left without explaining them. I told myself it was protection for the women in the program for the work, and some of it was. She paused. But some of it was that I didn't believe you'd actually hear me, so I stopped trying to be heard. I turned that into a wall and then expected you to understand what was behind it. Thayer looked at her. That wasn't fair either, she said. Hiding things and then being hurt that you didn't know them. They didn't resolve it there. One conversation in a hospital corridor doesn't do that, and both of them understood that. But they said the true things out loud, without positioning or defense, and that was different from anything they'd managed in the year before she left. The following months moved slowly and not always smoothly. Thayer came to medical appointments when Evelyn called and told him he could. He didn't come otherwise. He didn't show up at the apartment unannounced, didn't send expensive arrangements of flowers, didn't try to compress rebuilding into a grand gesture. He showed up when invited. He was present when present, absent when not, and he didn't make his consistency something he expected to be thanked for. Evelyn had the baby on a Tuesday in early spring. Thayer was in the room because she asked him to be. Afterward, he held the baby in the hallway while Evelyn slept, and a nurse showed him how to support the head properly, and he listened with complete attention like it was the most important instruction he'd received in his adult life. Months after that, the portrait hung in the maternity center corridor, and the engraved wall across from it was finished, and the center's director hosted a small gathering for the families and medical staff who'd been part of Eleanor's extended legacy. There was no press, no photographers, no foundation board members in expensive suits talking about generational giving, just the hallway, the names on the wall, the portrait at the end of it. Evelyn stood under Eleanor's gaze with her daughter in her arms, the baby's eyes still adjusting to the world, taking in light and shapes, and the particular quality of afternoon coming through the corridor window. Thayer stood to one side, not crowding her, giving her the space and also staying in it. Both things at once, which was new. Eleanor looked out at all of it with the same composed expression she'd maintained since 1891. The dark dress, the folded hands, the stillness that the painter had somehow made feel like a decision rather than a pose. Sabine had put the portrait in an auction to prove that Evelyn no longer had a place in the family. She had relabeled Eleanor to erase the name. She had built a careful story about a woman who had walked away and left nothing behind worth keeping. Instead, the portrait was here.
Eleanor's name was back on the canvas, back in the registry, back in the historical record where it belonged.
The work that had started with this woman in this city in 1893 had continued for 130 years, quietly and consistently, through women who understood that the point was never the credit. It was the work. It had always been the work. Evelyn looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Then she turned and walked toward the light at the end of the corridor, her daughter in her arms, Thayer one step behind.